Is DEI over? Just asking questions.
The most charitable take on it is that they're a waste of money,
What's the least charitable take on it?
that they're actively subverting the American constitutional order and promoting harmful race-based policies that are balkanizing the country.
Aaron Sibarium is our guest today. He's a good old-fashioned muckraking journalist at the Washington Free Beacon. He spends a lot of time exposing things that the left would probably rather stay hidden. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us.
So, Aaron, Trump promised in his inaugural address to end DEI. Let's look at that real quick.
I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based. As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female. This week, I will reinstate any service members who were unjustly expelled from our military for objecting to the COVID vaccine mandate with full back pay. And I will sign an order to stop our warriors from being subjected to radical political theories and social experiments while on duty. It's going to end immediately.
Okay. How's he doing so far by your estimation?
I think he's doing pretty well in the sense that he has picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And in fact, I think has gone much further than many people expected him to. The really easy stuff is to just ban DEI trainings in the federal government. That's easy. He didn't just do that. He rescinded LBJ's 1965 executive order requiring affirmative action in government contracting. That was really big, and represents arguably a huge kind of external jolt to the entire kind of civil rights state. He didn't just say that we're not going to allow federal contractors to do DEI, at least in its brazenly illegal manifestations. He said that he is basically implementing quotas for federal agencies, saying you have to have, it's not a quota because it's not a minimum, but up to 9 potential targets for investigation on my desk in 60 days or something like that. Maybe it's 90 days. I mean, he's basically doing, in some ways, what Biden did to promote DEI, this kind of whole of society effort to reorganize all the institutions of state and private power around promoting racial equity. He's essentially trying to do that in reverse for getting rid of DEI, right? Mobilize the entire federal apparatus to, I mean, you could argue it is a form of social engineering, in a sense, but he is trying to take a norm that seemed very deeply rooted in all sorts of bureaucracies and institutions and use the federal government to pummel it out of existence. And I would say that to the extent that's possible, and to the extent there are sort of just easy, obvious, perfectly constitutional ways of doing that, he seems to be ticking off most of the boxes on the list. I question whether the vibe shift, as it were, is quite as totalizing as it feels right now, and whether the kind of cultural vibe shift is ultimately going to correspond to long-term institutional change. I think that's more of the wild card.
Hmm. When you talk about this 1965 LBJ order, could you give us some context around that? Why was
Yeah,
that
so that
implemented? What was the effect?
Right. So that order basically just said that all government contractors have to take affirmative action to prevent race discrimination. Now, at that time, affirmative action did not have quite the same meaning that it has come to have today. And so initially, you could plausibly interpret that order as just saying federal contractors have to kind of have a plan in place to be sure that they're not racist, right? Whatever that means. And obviously, in the 60s, that kind of implies, maybe getting rid of racist hiring policies or doing things that today seem like, excesses of DEI, but maybe at that time would have been more justified. Like climate analyses of the firm's institutional climate or whatever. It was a very vague, broad term. What happens is that over the course of subsequent administrations and executive orders, affirmative action comes to basically mean de facto racial quotas. And so the way this works is they say, well, to show that you're complying with this order, you have to set up, quote unquote, goals and timetables, basically a plan to bring the demographics of your workforce into alignment with the demographics of the nation as a whole, or at least maybe it was into alignment with sort of the relevant pool of skilled workers, and how that gets determined is obviously up for debate. But in any case, they would say, well, it's not quota because you don't have to meet it. You just have to have a set number that you put on a piece of page and come up with a plan to move in the direction of meeting it. And if you don't do that to our satisfaction, you are in violation of this executive order and no longer eligible for federal contracting. So, kind of under the guise of just giving corporations a nudge to be a little more inclusive, in practice, what this did over time was it basically implemented, I would argue, a kind of system of de facto racial quotas throughout the American workforce.
So it seems like I really appreciate you tracing the lineage of this, but it does seem like a lot of the DI initiatives as we currently understand them and experience them in the federal government today are from the Biden era. To me, this has always been a little odd because when I think about the election that got Biden in office and the 2019-2020 cycle, it was very clear that a lot of the Democratic field was really swept up in George Floydism, for lack of a better term, the sort of like crazy, frenzied progressive politics in which many progressive groups were really questioning whether or not we should defund the police. And then they would move the goalposts and say, well, we didn't actually mean it. But like there was a lot of very radical talk of police abolition, prison abolition, abolition of cash bail, all of these things. It was a really weird, ultra radical progressive time. And yet Biden very much positioned himself as the candidate who was not a repudiation of that wholesale per se, but certainly not fully on board with that type of thing. So then it was odd that he, once in office, seemingly implemented a lot of things that these ultra progressives were wishing for. Um, what do you make of that? Is that the correct way of looking at the Biden legacy, or is there something that I'm missing related to like why was Biden so hell bent on bolstering this DI apparatus within the federal government?
Well, obviously, since Biden first signed that executive order promoting DEI, a lot has come to light about his mental capacities over the course of his presidency. So, to be fair,
You're
I'm
saying it
not
was Jill's
sure.
fault? Dr.
I'm
Jill's
not.
fault?
I mean, who knows? Maybe it was Dr. Jill. She has an education degree. That's never a good sign. But look, I think that there's a few things to keep in mind. So the first is that this stuff, part of why I just rehearsed this whole story about the 65 executive order, I think it has much deeper roots, right,
Mm.
than Joe Biden. And so the underlying kind of legal and structural forces that enabled DEI and kind of created these bureaucracies that then in turn developed their own incentives to grow and self-perpetuate, those forces are, I think, somewhat insensitive to minor changes in kind of the tone of the Democratic candidate. As we're seeing now, they're maybe not so insensitive to full-scale assaults from a Republican president who's determined to destroy them. But, the difference between, say, Biden's rhetoric and Elizabeth Warren's, I'm not sure how much that really matters to the functioning of one of these DEI bureaucracies on a day-to-day basis. And I don't really think the rhetoric of the Democratic Party standard bearer, at least historically, has been all that determinative. It's also important to remember that
Are you saying that basically among whether it's progressive campaign staff, people who staff the White House, basically they're sort of roughly in lockstep on advocating for a bunch of these types of policies? It doesn't matter which candidate you really pick?
broadly speaking, yes, I think that's right. I think there's a for a long time there was a real culture of deference within the Democratic Party leadership to the so-called groups, right? That's the term that folks like Ezra Klein are now using. Um, But some of that is just because the groups comprise a large part of the Democratic Party's base and the kind of Democratic Party policymaking apparatus, and uh, they can create problems for you if you go against them, at least in theory, right? And I think that the fear of a kind of, 68 style convention debacle is part of why Democrats weren't really sure how to handle the Israel-Gaza stuff, and were kind of caught in an awkward situation on that. And I think the same fear of a kind of intra-party blowup um, probably motivated the deferential attitude towards DEI, at least for a while. Maybe at this point, they think it's such a liability that they'll crack down on it. But I would note that uh, even Kamala Harris, right? There was a line on the left that, well, it's weird to accuse Kamala of being woke because she's not running on woke stuff. She's running on being a prosecutor. She's running on being just a kind of moderate neoliberal Democrat who's not Trump. Why are you accusing her of being woke? And leave aside the crazy things that she said on an ACLU questionnaire in 2019. The fact is, she didn't say on the campaign trail, yes, defund the police, and yes, trans surgeries for everyone. But she also didn't actively attack any of the people within her own coalition who were saying that. And thus it became a liability. And as you say, right, Biden, despite being the most moderate person in the field, was totally powerless, or at least he seemed powerless, to resist the kind of the leftward logic of the cathedral, right? Just dragging his presidency ever more left, even as he tried to position himself rhetorically as a moderate. And so then someone else comes along who does not have the kind of moderate bona fides of Joe Biden, has a record of saying that the federal government should pay for trans surgeries for immigrant detainees. And then when she's confronted with allegations that she's a Trojan horse for wokeness, all she does is say, no, 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 I was a cop. Like, that's not enough. You got to actually say, yeah, and by the way, like, no, we're not doing trans surgeries for immigrants. Yes, the police are good. BLM went way too far. DEI is bad. If you never say any of that and it's part of your coalition, a reasonable person is going to assume that even if you don't believe it, you're not going to really stop it from kind of cannibalizing the institutions of state power. And I'll just add quickly that, I think the inverse of this is that on the right, it's totally rational for people to say, look, maybe your modal Republican politician is not all the way there on Stop the Steal. Maybe they're not super duper pro-life, and they're not promising to throw women in jail for having abortions or whatever. But, you look around and you see, well, who are the people saying the crazy stuff about the election or abortion, the really far right stuff? And they're all part of the Republican Party coalition. It's not crazy for someone who's really, really worried about a repeat of January 6th or really, really worried about abortion rights, to say, Look, I mean, which party is more likely to be a vector for those fringe elements to exercise power? It's obviously the Republican Party, and just so on the left, like which party is more likely to be a vector to wield for kind of DEI apparatchiks to wield power? Obviously, the Democrats.
I want to really briefly, I mean, I want to move on to the text of the actual executive order, but I want to really briefly just go back to something you said a little bit ago about current Democratic Party possible insecurities related to what happened at their 1968 convention. Do you actually think that worry about factions within the party is still really dominant on operatives' minds, almost 60 years out from that? If so, I think that indicates a certain insecurity, right? Like maybe there's a this if and many people have commented along these lines, but it seems like within the Democratic Party, there's this like lack of confidence and this lack of direction of being able to say, that happened 57, 58 years ago. We're moving on.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how much the '68 convention really affected broader fights about DEI. I suspect that it wasn't consciously in the minds of anyone who was afraid to go against the so-called groups on that
Mm,
issue. I do think it did play a role in the Gaza stuff.
mm.
That's where, because that's really what became the focal point for left-wing activism in 2024. Um, Eh, um, I think in general, it's more of a kind of just basic status quo bias, go along to get along attitude, that a lot of politicians, probably on all sides of the aisle, have to some extent, and a basic desire to maintain peace within your coalition. Um, I think it also reflects, though, how just out of touch, the elite ranks of the Democratic Party were, because maybe you would have gotten a lot of flack from the ACLU and GLAAD, but I just don't think that that many rank and file Democrats are gonna stay home or vote for Donald Trump because you come out against some of the more extreme trans things, for example.
I
That just seems incorrect to me if you look at public opinion polling.
I do kind of broadly like this hypothesis that like the late 60s, early 70s has cast this long shadow over both political parties, whether it's the legacy of the 1968 convention for the Democrats or like the Bircherism stuff in the Republican Party, and sort of the challenges with trying to figure out how much conspiratorial fringe do you indulge. What about the sort of anti-communist legacy? To what degree do you bring that front and center? There's a lot of things that might be leading to insecurities in both parties and struggles with figuring out how to convert this messaging of the late 60s, early 70s into something good and sort of like free of baggage today.
You wanna know a fun fact? So Eugene McCarthy, the kind of spoiler candidate in '68, on the Democrat side, he I actually think in certain ways resembles, JD Vance on the Republican side in that he's very anti-war. He was an anti-war candidate, and JD is certainly part of that more populist wing. And Eugene McCarthy, I learned this from listening to the very excellent Rest is History podcast, which did a whole series on this. Eugene McCarthy was actually like a kind of Catholic intellectual who liked to go around college campuses and talk about nerdy Catholic theology stuff with kind of young, uh, anti-war hippies. Um, and it does seem to me that sort of
I'm tuned
certain
in. I'm not opposed to this.
right, right, like certain aspects of that kind of Catholic anti-war uh milieu that used to have a home in the Democratic Party have now been kind of transplanted onto the Republican Party. But it's very interesting that not only was he anti-war, but he was actually um a very devout Catholic and kind of into these weird sorts of esoteric debates that nowadays, you would associate with like, campus conservative debating groups, but I guess back then were a little less polarized. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, that's really insightful. It's interesting to see like for how much longer will JD Vance be allowed to consume communion, right? Given all his very early fight picking with the bishops. But that's a whole nother thing that we can get into at a different time. I do want to bring us to the DEI executive order signed on day one. It essentially says that DEI in the federal government is over, and we're going to have the OMB and OMP basically track down all of the positions and all of the related initiatives and basically delete them all. At HHS alone, Open the Books ID'd almost 300 DEI employees at a cost of, okay, so this is interesting. This has it broken down a little bit differently. This graphic that Zach is showing up here says 92 HHS employees, but I'm pretty sure other sources have found almost 300 spread out at a few different wings of HHS, totaling, with those initiatives as well, almost 40 million. 247 of those employees that at least Open the Books identified basically
Yeah.
made
Sorry,
six
Liz, just to
figures.
clarify on that. It's so
Oh,
like
it's
these are
across
all
all of
the
these
this is everything that is like under the umbrella
of
of the health
HHS.
department. So yeah.
Okay, this makes
So
sense. So
294. Yeah.
So we have 16 DEI employees at Indian Health Service. We have 52 at the National Institutes of Health. We have, Medicare and Medicaid have 32 DEI employees. And so basically all of these total almost 300, and 247 of those made upwards of six figures according to 2023 data, which to me is crazy because when I think about a DEI employee, at least when I think DEI employee plus federal government employee, I think pretty low salary. And six figures today isn't what it used to be in 1970 or whatever, but like that's a pretty massive chunk of cash that's being devoted to people. And we're just talking about one agency and all of the different arms of it within the federal government. Um, will anything be lost, Aaron, when these workers are all summarily axed?
The actual DEI ones, I mean, no, I'm sorry. I really don't think that they add any value. And that's the most charitable take on it is that they're a waste of money.
What's the least charitable take on it?
Like that they're actively subverting the American constitutional order and promoting harmful race-based policies that are balkanizing the country by race, and pushing us down the path to a kind of dark tribal future. That's the darker take on it. But obviously now they are not just trying to cut DEI, they're trying to cut all sorts of alleged government waste and to effectively shutter or at least severely downsize certain agencies like USAID. And there, right, I think the cost benefit is, of course, a lot more complicated. And, I'm not someone who I think there's a lot of media hysteria right now, but I also, think that there is some merit to the Chesterton's fence idea that when some institution or bureaucratic structure exists, you should ask why it's there before just nuking it. And I don't think that the administration's doing that. On the other hand, there is also something to be said for the idea that bureaucracies can become so sclerotic, so full of perverse incentives, and so fundamentally ineffective at their stated mission that they really can't be reformed from the inside, and you basically do have to start from scratch. So I'm honestly kind of torn on that one, and I think it's a pretty fact-specific question.
I guess what I'm wondering is where this stops. Like, how far does it go? Because there's this other executive order that I'm going to bring up here in a second, called Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity, which is partially targeted at federal contractors. It's saying we don't want any contractor who's doing services for the federal government to be engaged in DEI. It also goes further and says, I further order all agencies to enforce our longstanding civil rights law and combat illegal private sector DEI preferences, mandates, policies, programs, and activities. In the section called Encouraging the Private Sector to End Illegal DEI Discrimination and Preferences, one of the methods of encouragement is recommending ways that they can enforce federal civil rights laws and taking other appropriate measures to encourage the private sector to end illegal discrimination and preferences, including DEI, essentially start preparing the lawsuits against private employers. I've got to say, as much as I might object to the use of DEI and certain aspects of DEI in both the public and private sector, should we be drawing a hard line here and saying it the federal government doesn't need to be kind of managing the hiring practices and the HR practices of the private sector in this way?
Well, I think it's important to note, first of all, that the federal government already does manage the hiring practices of the private sector through civil rights law, and there is no real constituency in the United States on either side of the aisle that genuinely wants to repeal those laws. They disagree about how they should be interpreted, but there's a very strong consensus in favor of, broadly speaking, I think the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Boy, have you not spent enough time at libertarian student conferences. Just kidding.
Right, but, like, those people have no
Yeah, they have no
power and
political power. Fair.
right, and they're often kind of crankish and sorry, I should be nice to the libertarians, but
I
look,
wouldn't say that this is broadly representative of all libertarians. I think it's a very, extremely
yeah.
small subset who decide to make this their big issue.
Yeah, but so unless you're one of those people, that there's a very broad-based consensus in the United States that some kind of civil rights laws that regulate private entities are a good thing. So, in principle, I don't see a deep distinction between what Trump is doing here and what we've been doing over 60 years. And remember that a lot of the language, not all, but a lot of the language in those executive orders specifies kind of DEI policies that are smoke screens for illegal preferences, right? It's less clear to me that, a quote unquote DEI program that just requires everyone to do a 30-minute training where they're told, you should be nice to everyone, regardless of how they look and regardless of how much money they have. Like, if that's literally the content of the training, it's not clear to me that these orders really touch that. Maybe they will in practice, but not obvious that that's
I
the case.
I guess what I'm looking at what I'm thinking about though is if you're running a company and you're looking at your workforce and you're wondering something like, why don't we have more women or why don't we have more people from this community? Like if we break down the letters DEIA, we can add accessibility on there. These are all different components and some might be good, some might be bad, some might be applied poorly. And so if you're, a recruiter thinking about, are there ways that I can do a better job recruiting women into this company or something like that? I just wonder about the federal government coming in with this agenda, the hammer, the DEI hammer, and everything is a nail, rather than, again, you brought up Chesterton Spence earlier. Maybe there is a reason that companies are acting in certain ways in their own self-interest that has nothing to do with discriminating against white people or whatever, and more to do with, I think this is going to make the company run better.
Yeah. So so a couple things. So one is that, again, if you look at, this isn't the executive order, but if you look at like guidance that the EEOC put out, and it's guidance that is, supposed to be, I think, broadly consistent with Trump's executive orders, it says, right, that there are certain kinds of programs like that you can do, provided they adhere very strictly to principles of non-discrimination. I would maybe challenge the idea that this is something that private businesses should be concerned with. I mean, you said, well, it might make the business better. Well, if it actually makes the business better and you're genuinely trying to make the hiring more merit-based, and that just results in a higher number of women, well, that's great. But, right, if the goal that you're setting is more women and not more of the most qualified people who will make the business run better, I mean, the only way that that really makes sense from a business perspective is if you believe this kind of theory that the mere presence of people with different anatomies or different skin colors, like, somehow magically increases productivity. Um, and I just don't really think that there's any good reason to believe that. I mean, I think that
Mhm.
there's obviously good reasons to think that if you arbitrarily restrict um, people from joining your company based on immutable characteristics, that will harm productivity and business efficiency. But like, there's just no good reason a priori to think that um, Google will run better if it's like, you know, 50% women instead of 40% women.
I
I
mean,
mean, sorry,
I'm
like, I
not
just
the
don't really see
I mean, I'm
why,
not the
like, we
person.
should believe it.
I don't know what the proper ratio for an optimal, tech office is, but it is something that I would rather leave to the management to decide for themselves. I mean, to kind of flip it on its head in a weird way, we can like we can bring up the Demore memo, right? Like the whole point, the James Demore memo, the whole point of that was like, hey, here's some politically incorrect solutions to your problem of having too many male software engineers. Like you could redesign the like, is that really a conversation that should be off limits in the corporate workplace because
Yeah, like,
it's somehow violating civil rights law?
no, I don't think that James Damore's memo should be off limits simply because it uh, takes as its object the, increasing the percentage of women through kind of gender blind means, right? I think if people want to have that discussion, that's, I guess, fine. But I would just note that if you flip this around a little bit, you actually do get into pretty dark and legally murky territory pretty fast. Because you could say, well, we've decided based on our master AI algorithm that actually we believe that like the optimal composition of our company for business efficiency is that there can be like 40% Jews, but there should be no more than 20% Black people because our algorithm has decided this. And we know that we can't racially discriminate because, of this pesky civil rights law. So what we're going to do is implement a bunch of kind of ostensibly race neutral proxies that our algorithm has calculated will just happen to spit out the exact percentage we want that we believe will maximize business efficiency. I'm pretty sure that under existing civil rights precedent, that would still be illegal, right? And so you have to ask yourself anytime you want to offer these kind of defenses of DEI from the standpoint of business, efficiency or kind of institutional autonomy, sort of would the exact same thing be allowed if you changed the kind of relevant groups that you were talking about maximizing or minimizing as the case may be. And usually when you change, right, it from, you know, women to men, right, or white people to Black people, suddenly, you know, it becomes very clear that this would never pass muster in a court of law. So that doesn't mean that there's no circumstances in which you
I'm
can
not,
talk about this stuff,
Aaron, hold
but
on though. I have to object there because I don't know that that's necessarily true. If you were to go to a company or an industry that is female dominated, as much of the medical industry is now becoming more and more female dominated. If someone high up in the hospital bureaucracy is like, why aren't we getting like as many young ambitious men in this industry anymore in psychology or whatever it is? I don't think that should be a forbidden question to ask. I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And there is like, we can have a sort of abstract historical debate about what should have happened in 1964, but like here and now, like there is a difference between sort of discriminating against a minority and asking why is a group underrepresented in this industry? Is there something
Sure.
that
I
we
think
are doing that we could be doing to better
right.
recruit these people that we're missing?
Well, but I think the premise of that question is that there's some kind of artificial or unfair barrier that is preventing us from identifying talent in a particular pool of people. So, yeah, I think that's fine, and I would agree that if the DEI executive orders are interpreted to prevent those kinds of efforts to essentially improve meritocracy, that would be a problem. Um, I'm just skeptical. I guess what I would say is I don't really think that that is what most companies have
Hmm.
really been doing, and I
Well,
also think it's
what about the I aspect of it, the inclusion? Because that is about taking someone who might be having a culture shock and deciding,
Okay.
hey, we're
That
like if
that
you've got let's say you're in the tech sector and you've got lots of immigrants you're employing and you're like, what can we do to like better smooth this transition? That might be within the DEI rubric, and it might be good for the company, and you've got the federal government saying, "No, we're gonna sue you."
I mean, yeah, that could happen. I have to say, I think that it's important in these debates to just first ask a more basic question, which is, would the scenario you're describing be better or worse than this current status quo in which there's rampant race discrimination and crazy Robin DiAngelo style trainings? And my argument would be that it would be better that the scenario you're describing, even if it's not great. Like, I agree
Mm,
that that would not be good if
mm,
those kinds of efforts get caught in the crossfire, but there's always going to be some collateral damage when you implement a new policy that's designed to kind of get rid of a set of deeply rooted toxic social norms. And you can't allow the mere presence of collateral damage to paralyze you. You have to look at are the kind of likely unintended consequences or edge cases really going to outweigh benefits of getting rid of all the kind of stuff that I think all of us on this call agree is bad.
mm.
And look, I mean, reasonable people can disagree on that. I just want to point out that I think that's an important question. Like, the mere fact that Trump's executive orders on this will probably, you know, inflict some kind of unfair harm on somebody is not really a good argument against the executive orders, because you could make that argument about basically any government policy. Um, the other thing I would just say is that, again, I keep harping on the fact that we already kind of a lot of the things you're talking about as if they are new or kind of potential developments in many respects already exist. So, for example, you talked about trying to make sure it's inclusive, right? And
Yeah.
the environment is not putting up undue um, obstacles to people of certain backgrounds. I mean, there arguably is a tool that we already have for that called hostile environment law, which says, to boil it down to its essence, it basically says that companies have an obligation to police the speech, in part, of their employees in order to prevent the creation of a work environment that is objectively sort of harassment or discrimination that is so severe and pervasive that it effectively constitutes a hostile environment in which, a reasonable person can't be expected to work or can't be expected to work on the same terms. Um, Now, you could either just say, well, we already have hostile environment law, so it takes care of this thing you're worried about. As long as he doesn't get rid of hostile environment law, we're good, and we can just use that instead. It's already been developed. Another way to look at it is to say, that hostile environment law has a lot of problems and excesses, and in many ways gave rise to some of the more noxious elements of DEI that we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
right? I agree that we should, I mean, this is an
That's
easy
kind of my
case.
worry.
Well, sure. So I mean, here's the thing. Like, obviously, I think, quid pro quo sexual harassment should be illegal, and you should be fired for that. And any attempt to, you know, interfere with that longstanding precedent would be bad. But there's a lot of other things, right, where what ends up happening is that sexual harassment or racism is defined so broadly, and these companies adopt these zero tolerance policies that effectively means that they have to constantly surveil their employees' speech, and that's where a lot of these trainings come in, and where a lot of these kind of unjust, quote unquote, cancellations come from. Um, and if you get rid of that policing, to go back to Chesterton's fence, you probably will see more kind of racial and sexual locker room talk that makes certain people uncomfortable. But you're also going to see, I think, fewer of the kinds of insane cancellations that we experienced at kind of the peak of 2020. And so some of this, again, comes down to just a cost benefit question of what do you think that the benefits will outweigh the harms? And look, again, I think reasonable people can differ. I just want to point out that, like, um, some of the things that you're talking about as good things are kind of very intimately intertwined with other things that you would identify as bad. And so, you're not going to get a free lunch on any of this stuff.
I think that locker room talk is something that really shouldn't matter that much to high agency people. And I think generally speaking, we've sort of gotten into the zone of over policing these types of things. I mean, I kind of chafe at the idea that inclusion matters all that much from a business standpoint. I think it should be perfectly reasonable for companies, I suppose, to consider whether fostering a more inclusive environment would allow them to be able to hire more suitable candidates from a perspective of merit of who's most qualified. But I generally think that in the last maybe 10 years, possibly even 20 years, there's been such an overemphasis on this type of thing. It's not clear to me, like, I'm the type of person who some of these initiatives are ostensibly designed to help, but it's not clear to me that they actually make my path all that much easier. Instead, I find them to be pretty condescending because my personal tolerance for what could be termed locker room talk is just like extremely high. Like, it's fine. It doesn't matter to me. But one of the things that really bothers me that I think kind of ties some of these things together, and just to like fully caveat, James Damore's my buddy. He did his first ever keg stand at my house. My husband and I taught him how, which is very cute. Like, that's how you know you're really fostering this like nerd party synthesis environment when James Damore is over at your house. You're like holding his legs while he does. This is not a joke. I have pictures. But one of the things that really always has been so striking to me about James's case is that Google invited the discourse. He wasn't just providing this memo, it wasn't unsolicited. He wasn't being weird and autistic and just randomly volunteering this. Google claimed that they wanted to hear from their engineers, from the entire community of Googlers. And he, I think, perhaps naively thought that they actually meant it and that they actually meant that they were interested in entertaining all sorts of viewpoints. But this kind of brings me to, I think, the thing that's most frustrating with all of this, where it's like, whether it's a boilerplate HR training where you're taught to be nice to people who wear hijabs or whatever, just like obviously self-evident things that any competent adult would already know, there's just this obsession, there's this fixation with all of this. And it's crazy to me that it's permeated not just our federal government, but so much of our discourse, to the point where, no offense, guys, I'm enjoying this conversation, but where we have to have conversations like this. There's such an over-examination of this type of thing. And I just wonder, what is the total like productive loss from companies being so fixated on this, and then there being this massive partisan war over the degree to which this type of thing ought to matter? It really makes me um, kind of just yearn for, like, I think 90s, early 2000s, and even up to like 2010, the sort of early Obama era left, where there was a little bit of this hope that we would return to like a colorblind meritocratic society. And I'm not totally sure what accounts for the fact that we culturally lost sight of that, but I don't feel helped by it. I feel hurt by the fixation on all of this.
Yeah, I share that aspiration with you. I do wonder that my point is not that DEI across the board is good, or that it's that having a little humility and saying this is a social problem. This is a social process that needs to play out. Not that, like, this is like the conservative libertarian divide as I see it. It's really like the conservative view is we need to conserve like every not only conserve every aspect of civil rights law, but like expand it to protect all these new categories like white men. And I'm like, maybe that was the problem in the first place, and we do just need to loosen up and have a little more freedom and let the market process play out instead of having deciding like we're gonna now overcorrect it in this other direction.
But
I
I'm gonna
don't
say
see
something a
us
little
get
different though.
I don't see us getting to that blind like utopia through some
It's
sort
not
of like
utopia, it's
government
2009,
some sort of
right?
top-down government program. I
Well,
think
right.
that
I
But
is
mean,
a process that
that's
needs to play out.
but that's I think I want to let Aaron go in a second, but I
Yeah.
think like that slightly misunderstands what I'm saying. Which first of all, it's not utopian. It's what we were on track to do for a while, and then we got derailed. And second of all, it's more that both the federal government and vast swaths of the private sector need to just not even be having this conversation at all. Like this is something that should have maybe taken up 0.5% of the total conversation time, the total discourse at like a Fortune 500 company. And for whatever reason, we've gotten lost somewhere along the way. And now it takes up like 10% of the conversations, 10% of the total time when figuring out how to organize a company. To me, that just feels really out of whack. And I welcome um, the Coinbase, Basecamp. Like there have been quite a few prominent CEOs who've said, no more. We're not soliciting commentary on this, and this is not going to be something we emphasize at the top level. Like we have to return. This is
can I
nonsense.
also just make another point, which is earlier, Zach, you were contrasting the conservative perspective, which you characterized as kind of wanting to accept and even expand civil rights law, with the libertarian perspective, which you implied was the opposite, I guess,
Mhm,
on this.
mhm.
Well, so like, why not push that further and the libertarian perspective further and say, you know what, just get rid of all civil rights law and the market will sort it out. And whatever ultimately businesses that discriminate in unprofitable ways will go out of business. And businesses that kind of through market experimentation identify the quote unquote optimal level of discrimination will survive. And so we'll just get to a much better social equilibrium,
Yeah.
right? Where we get exactly as much kind of, discrimination or DEI or not as we need, and market returns are maximized. I
You know what,
mean,
Aaron? You just passed the Turing test because I find myself nodding along with that. It's
okay.
like this is really eventually where we do want to head. And
We
I
want
mean,
to have a
Right.
Liz-free podcast once and for all. I
you
I
know,
see
But
where
so
you're
what you're
coming from.
saying, but
I do think that I mean, we don't have to get into a historical debate about this, but there is some evidence that discrimination, even in the past, even at the, the most like retrograde version of America, that it was economically destructive.
yeah,
And so there were these unregulated space. Thaddeus Russell has written about this. There are these
sure.
unregulated spaces like pubs where there was race mixing and everything because people wanted to make money. So I think that discrimination in general is not economically productive. There are some circumstances where it might be, but I think that we're now in a place in our culture where we can move past a lot of this and have real free association.
Sure. I just want to point out that you are basically making the case for the repeal of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay,
Which no, like I respect it. I'm just saying, like, again, you are
I'm
taking
not
a
running for
view.
office, so I don't
Yeah,
really care.
exactly. But
Yeah,
like, that's the other thing. I think you have to remember that like if your critique of Trump's DEI policies logically implies that he should like dismantle the civil rights state, well, I mean, you know, even Trump in all his ability to defy political gravity probably is not going to touch a norm quite as deeply rooted as that one. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but like, even he is subject to certain political constraints. Again, I'm not saying that your view is wrong on the merits. It's just like we should acknowledge, I think, that that is
I think that's
a
fair.
very, very libertarian view that is just objectively not really within the Overton window of mainstream American politics right now.
I think you're right about that. John, our producer, wants me to just clarify the legality, illegality. Like, do we have do you have a clear sense of, with the executive order, what is something that would fall on the legal side of the line and what would be illegal, or is it just kind of inherently vague as it pertains to
I mean,
private workplace? Yeah.
right now, I think it's probably a little vague because there hasn't been enough litigation to work out the details. But my reading of the order is that programs that were already established to be illegal, by programs that were already seen as like perfectly legal and kosher under, say, the EEOC. I don't really think this is meant to change any of that.
Okay.
Granted, people may try to, and some agencies might interpret it to mean that even those programs are illegal. But there actually was guidance that the EEOC at least put out in the wake of Trump's executive order. This is the agency that deals with employment discrimination. That or maybe was it that, or was it? I think it was the EEOC.
It was the EEOC.
Yeah,
I
and
forgot about what you're talking about.
it said, I think, that affinity groups were allowed, but they just can't exclude anyone based on race.
Mhm.
So in theory, I think the idea is you could have a Black affinity group, but white people have to be allowed to join. And furthermore, you can't discriminate in which affinity groups are allowed in the first place. So I think that means that if you allow a Black and LGBT affinity group, you also have to allow a white straight affinity group.
Oh boy.
Or in our case, a German descendant affinity group. For me, it's
Right.
not
So
too.
Lots of
I
fun
don't know how
affinity
that's
That's
going
not
to
the right
groups.
vibe.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how that's going to go, but
Not well.
if you're just but if you're going based off of the guidance actually does not require employers to just shut down all these groups entirely, which actually I think is like, again, Trump has this capacity to say something really extreme and then implement it in a much more moderate way. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what happens here. Like, that guidance is a good example where the rhetoric is really extreme, like purge all DEI. But in practice, right, they're not even going after all the affinity groups. They're just saying that you have to treat them fairly, which,
There's a fairness, there's a symmetry there that the effect, of course, will be that there will be no affinity groups because nobody wants to be hosting the white American club at their company. So that's the effective outcome. But I could see what you're saying, which is that there is, given our current situation, there's a symmetry and a fairness there. Sorry, Liz.
This all goes to my point from earlier, where it's just like, this is the high schoolification of American bureaucracy and business. Like, what on earth could you possibly do with a workplace affinity group? Like, have friends at work and otherwise live a normal life, but it's not clear to me that you need the workplace gay straight alliance or whatever. Like, that's something we had at my high school. Okay, fine, cool. You have free time in high school, but why is this type of thing being wrapped into what we see as standard in the workplace? To me, it just makes absolutely no sense. I do want to move us to the other really hot button issue of the last, I don't even know what time scale we're even talking about at this point. I guess Trump has been in office for 20 days now, and it feels like it's been a year. Basically, Trump has deputized Elon Musk to restructure the federal workforce in a major way, and they started axing whole entire agencies, starting with USAID, laying off the vast majority of its 10,000 employees, offering them, buyouts, but canceling about 800 contracts and awards in particular, spending a lot of time highlighting some of the most egregious, in their words, woke initiatives. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, rattled off a whole bunch of examples. John, can we roll that clip?
And here's the reason why Elon Musk and others have been taking a look. Because if you look at the waste and abuse that has run through USAID over the past several years, these are some of the insane priorities that organization has been spending money on. $1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia's workplaces, $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. I don't know about you, but as an American taxpayer, I don't want my dollars going towards this crap, and I know the American people don't either, and that's exactly what Elon Musk has been tasked by President Trump to do, to get the fraud, waste, and abuse out of our federal government. Thank you, guys.
I'm really torn on this because, on one hand, in terms of actual USAID programs, the Serbia thing was real. I looked into that. A lot of these other programs, they're sort of scrambling the message. A lot of these were State Department administered programs, technically speaking. But then there were a whole bunch of sort of stupid and egregious USAID projects that she didn't even list. Like, for example, a bunch of money doled out to electric vehicle subsidies in Vietnam, I believe, right? Like, if you actually go through USAID grants, it's kind of insane what they've been using our taxpayer dollars for. And on one hand, it's just a drop in the budget or a drop in the bucket. This is a very small part of the overall federal budget. But on the other hand, it's profoundly disrespectful that they should think that even $30,000 worth of our money ought to be, spent on an opera promoting trans rights somewhere far away. I mean, it seems like, to fully steelman the concept, the idea is that USAID ought to be promoting American soft power. But the program also does a lot of really good things, whether it's distributing HIV/AIDS medicine in far-flung places in Africa, or funding lots and lots of clinical trials. I'm pretty torn on this because I'm anti-trans opera and I'm pro people not dying of AIDS. Aaron, what should we actually think about the scrapping of USAID?
Wow, you're pro people not dying of AIDS. Wow,
Controversially
wow.
anti-trans opera,
Such a
pro
cut.
no
Oh my
AIDS.
God.
Brave.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's a tough issue. And I'm not about to offer a full-scale defense of every cut the administration has made or the way in which they're going about doing it. What I would say is that there's a kind of perverse moral logic to complaints about funding being disrupted, when those complaints come from people who consciously chose to integrate an incredibly unpopular and politically toxic ideology into the infrastructure of all grant making and aid funding, right? Such that it would be impossible to eliminate that ideology without substantial disruptions to the international aid infrastructure or to, say, federal grants for biomedical research, right? If you actually, I think, were to try faithfully to comply with Trump's executive orders, which, maybe not everyone on this podcast loves them to the same degree, but if you're broadly in favor of the idea that a lot of DEI just is a cover for illegal racial preferences or is a waste of money and that's bad, well, unfortunately, DEI criteria really are like everywhere in these grants. And it probably is not possible to get it out without some disruptions and some chaos, frankly. So again, you can ask, is this degree of disruption really worth it? Are they going about this in the right way? Fine. But I think it's pretty disingenuous to act like they're just that all of the disruption is solely and completely Trump's fault, when it was really mainstream progressivism that decided to yoke all of modern science funding to DEI, which was kind of foreseeably going to have this consequence sooner or later. And people said it would. People said there's going to be a blowback, and then, science funding and universities are going to be in jeopardy, and no one listened. So, someone made this point on Twitter with a controversial analogy, but I kind of like it, which was, it's a bit like, when you're complaining about, good government programs being caught in the crossfire of the DEI purge, it's a bit like complaining about civilian casualties when Israel bombs, a civilian target that is being used by Hamas, right, to launch rockets, or that contains an entire weapons depot under it. Like, yes, you can debate whether it's really worth it to, kill the civilians, but you're not really doing an honest moral evaluation of the situation if you don't acknowledge that the civilians are only in harm's way because Hamas deliberately put them there. And just so, I think you're not doing an honest evaluation of these cuts to good government programs if you don't acknowledge that, like, you know, there was a decision made to inject kind of DEI into the entire infrastructure of science funding. I mean, I think that obviously these are different things. I'm not comparing DEI to Hamas, but like it's the same kind of moral logic.
I like that Zach came out in favor of scrapping the Civil Rights Act, and then you decided to one up him by comparing like Democrats in modern America to I don't know, the Hamas terrorists. But I do get what you're saying, where it's like
No, no, I'm not comparing them. They're different. They're different. Don't cancel me.
there is a frustrating dynamic though, and I struggle with like the effective altruist or the like utilitarian standpoint here would be to be far more concerned with the actual damage being done to people in far-flung places. Um, and there's a little bit of this question of like, well, just because we oppose the way that progressives did this, does that mean that these people who had no role in that ought to suffer the consequences? And should we not be considering the many, many, many lives caught in the crosshairs here? But at the same time, I'm curious. I want you to engage with the idea of like, what would a restructured, better USAID look like if the idea is legitimately to invest in important medical research and to extend American soft power across the globe? Or is that an invalid, stupid, pointless goal?
I don't necessarily think it's invalid or stupid at all. And I think PrepFAR and other things like that clearly, pass a cost benefit test, right? They account for a really tiny share of our tax dollars, but do an insane amount of good. Those are the kinds of programs you'd want to focus on. The question is how many of those programs that clearly pass the test actually exist, first of all. And then the second question is whether US aid as it was constituted before Musk's takeover was staffed by people who shared that outlook. And granted, this is something that there needs to be more reporting on, and we won't know the full story, I think, probably for many years. So I try to be a bit agnostic about it. But, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in an interview that a lot of the people at USAID just didn't see themselves as working to advance America's interests. They saw themselves as these kind of nebulous global citizen trying to promote a kind of progressively tinged concept of the good across the globe, right? Not just promote, uncontroversial programs like PrepFAR or, America's soft power. And if that is true, I don't know if it is, but it doesn't seem totally implausible, just given what I know of the kind of people who would join organizations like USAID. There's a case to be made that if not either for maybe downsizing the agency or for at least replacing its personnel with a pretty different group of people, right? If it's staffed by people who don't believe in the mission, Liz, that you just articulated, then it's not going to carry out that mission in practice. So, again, the devil's in the details, and I probably would not have chosen to do it quite the way it seems to be being done. But I also do think that people maybe are underrating how difficult it can be to reform these bureaucracies without massive disruption, right? And more generally, right? Sometimes there are problems that just can't really be solved without leaving a whole lot of destruction in their wake, right? This isn't necessarily my own view, but there is an argument you hear both from some people on the far left and kind of the more restrainer realist right that gives Biden a certain degree of credit for the Afghanistan withdrawal, because even though it was disastrous and you can point to a million things they did wrong, the thought is, well, this was such a clusterfuck, pardon my French, that realistically there was no way to withdraw without some degree of catastrophic consequences. And if you allowed the possibility of those consequences to be a veto on the decision to withdraw, in practice, you were signing up for forever occupation, and it's not obvious that forever occupation of Afghanistan is really worth it, worth avoiding, that momentary, that single moment of shock and humiliation. Again, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think for people who are sympathetic to that view in the Afghanistan context, I think there's kind of a corollary to it here, which is these systems, they were just going to chug along indefinitely and continue to be extremely wasteful and inefficient. And the steel man, I think, of kind of Muskism, right, if we can call it that, is that you need a kind of moment of temporary shock and pain and chaos. And you have to assess that, look at that not in the context of the moment and all the people who are crying about how their jobs are lost. You have to compare that to an alternative in which the status quo just persisted indefinitely and maybe slowly degenerated and got worse and worse, right? I think when you try to take the longer view, it's just less obvious how these trade-offs stack up. And again, reasonable people will disagree.
A less sexy example of this might be entitlement reform in the future.
Yeah.
But I think there's something interesting that you're raising here that was present with the Afghanistan withdrawal in the Biden administration, but is also now really present in the early Trump days with Elon Musk and Doge, where I think Americans are sort of across the board grappling with this question of how much destruction are we willing to bear? And are we going to sort of up our tolerance for this type of thing if it is, in fact, what needs to be done in order to get the United States fully out of Afghanistan or in order to try to cut down on waste in the federal bureaucracy? And I think it's a little bit of an open question because so far we've seen a pretty massive and I think a kind of hysterical freak out over what Elon Musk is doing, and many, many people calling it a constitutional crisis. But I, at least, I think have, maybe it's just my libertarian tendency, but a higher tolerance for this idea of like, well, you gotta like Malay chainsaw it up, baby. Like it's time, and it's not always pretty. But I do wonder whether embracing some amount of short term chaos and destruction and fallout is the price that we must pay in order to have greater long term stability and to right our track again.
There was a good post by my friend Jason Willick who said something to the effect of, the line that what worked at Twitter won't work in the federal government would be more convincing if it weren't coming from people who said that these tactics wouldn't work at Twitter, right? Because there
Yeah.
were a lot of people who, when Elon Musk took over Twitter and basically did this, you forget, like Wired, I think it was actually Wired, the same publication that's doing all these exposés on Doge, some of which are perfectly fine journalism, but that organization, like, they were predicting literally that Twitter was going to shut down within a week, that it would lose the human capital it needed to function as a website and be overrun with glitches and literally be non-functional. Whatever you think of what Elon Musk did to the platform, that was completely and utterly spectacularly wrong. It still works fine, and someone who's not on Twitter all the time wouldn't really notice the differences between pre and post Musk. And he fired 80% of the people.
It runs better now.
Right.
He fired 80% of the workforce, and now a lot of us get paid via this platform.
True. Right.
Like,
so
it's
like,
literally better.
right. It's yeah. I mean, it's certainly there are certainly respects in which it's better, and again, the federal government and Twitter are different things, and the stakes are different, right? You screw up at Twitter, a website goes away. You screw up in the federal government, maybe like a bunch of people lose their homes or a nuke is launched or whatever. Like, sure, stakes are very different. Concede. But when you intuitively, it seems a bit implausible that there would be zero commonalities whatsoever between a large corporation and the federal government. It does seem like there's probably certain laws that just govern bureaucracies, qua bureaucracies, whether they're private or public. Certainly, there's a lot of, I think, sociologists and economists who would say that such laws exist at some level of generality. And so, granting that there are differences and we shouldn't run the government the exact same way we run a corporation, it is a little weird, especially for kind of self-described, proponents of the science, to kind of just act like kind of, the science of managerial organization or public choice theory or bureaucratic bloat, that all the findings about that stuff maybe you can kind of apply them to Twitter, but they go out the window when they apply to the government. It's like, well, why, right? So yeah, I certainly have some worries about what Musk is doing, but I think that the people criticizing him have proven themselves to be very bad at predicting what will happen when you fire a lot of people, right? In the case of Twitter and probably in other cases too. And so I just, you know, eh, there's some people whose doomsday predictions I take more seriously, but unless you've gotten a lot of these questions right in the past, I don't really
Yeah.
trust your prognostication.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and also sympathetic to the idea your Afghanistan analogy. Both, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there was going to be chaos no matter how we got out of Afghanistan. There's going to be chaos no matter how you reshuffle and restaff the government. I think that there's also an aspect, perhaps under discussed, of the role that AI might play in automating a lot of these jobs. I'm sure that's on Elon Musk's mind as well. But to bring us home, I wanted to just zoom out again because you mentioned near the top that you're not sure if the vibe shift is going to fully trickle down from the federal government to the whole of society or not. I mean, there's a definite vibe shift across the entire culture. I think we'd all agree. But the question is, how deep are those vibes, or how resonant are they? I guess. What do you think? Do you expect that? Like, is DEI over?
The existence of bureaucracies called diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies might be over, or at least far fewer of them are going to exist. The
Hmm.
question is whether the underlying ideas and structures of control are going away.
Yeah.
And some of them maybe, but I think others are going to prove a lot more persistent. And to give you just one example, I recently wrote a story about all these bias reporting systems that have cropped up at the state level. So they're not run by universities, they're run by actual cities and states, so that people can effectively report their neighbors for wrongthink. And of course, they say, most of them, not all, but most of them say that they're not collecting names and that identifying information is kept private. And this is just about tracking data and statistics on hate, because this can
Mhm.
somehow be used to help predict hate crimes. So it's actually kind of like predictive policing. It's almost like woke minority
Yeah.
report, right? And I'm serious. They say all of this stuff. And that's at the state level. There might be certain things Trump
And
could do about
you
it.
recorded yourself calling one of those hotlines.
Having a bit of a dispute with my neighbor. I just moved, and I was talking to my neighbor, and I said I was Muslim. I said I thought that what was going on in Gaza was a genocide. And then the next day, my neighbor puts up a huge Israeli flag, like on his front door, and it felt very targeted.
If you feel like there is an expression of animus against your religious beliefs, then that's a bias incident. And I want to center your perspective. And if you feel like this was a bias incident, that the flag is an expression of animosity against your faith or your country of origin, then we honor that, and I want to acknowledge that. So that would be a bias incident. Even if it is not very explicit, we go with whatever the victim is experiencing. And if your sense is that this is based on a discrimination against your faith or your country of origin, then we'll take that. That's how I would document it.
You said you would log this as a bias incident?
That's how you are reporting it.
Yeah.
So I would honor your perspective.
Okay.
So
that'll like go into the state's like database or whatever it is of this, so that there's like a record that this happened.
Right. And it would go in the state database.
This is the other thing I want to ask you, just if there were any other resources you could direct me to, because honestly, it can be kind of isolating. There's all this Zionist propaganda out there, and I just it really upset me, and I wasn't really sure exactly where else to turn.
As a victim of a bias incident, you qualify for mental health support. So if your insurance does not cover the mental health support, you'd be able to get coverage and funding through the Department of Justice.
Right. So it was insane.
Did you go to therapy, Aaron?
I did not go to therapy for that. But
So this is the future you're envisioning then, is Oregon, California. These are going to be the holdouts, and it might even get worse where we've got like a total like
yeah, I mean, the
therapeutic
fact that
surveillance state.
right, the fact that this is happening in 2024 to 2025, and it really didn't receive any attention until I wrote a story about it. And frankly, that story kind of got lost in the flurry of Trump's executive orders. It hasn't even received that much attention now. Like, I mean, that is a really large network of kind of bureaucratic control mechanisms designed to police and arguably deter First Amendment protected speech based on the feelings or imagined sensitivities of minority groups. That's almost the definition of wokeness, right? That's just what
Yeah.
wokeness and DEI kind of is. And uh, it's there's some argument that some of these systems may violate the First Amendment, but it's not clear, right? The government can collect data on a lot of things. And so, if you assume that these systems do hold up to legal scrutiny, you could have a world in which we kind of condition a whole generation of people in blue states to just accept government sanctioned snitch line as a normal and acceptable practice. So, yeah, aspects of wokeness may be peaking, but
Yeah, it's wild to see this
right,
migrate from the campus to real life. Like, I remember all the microaggressions, like tip lines, and everything, and now there's a state
it's
government
crazy.
doing this. Yeah. Well, I know you got to run, Aaron. Let me ask you the last question of the show, which is, what is a question you think more people should be asking?
All right. I want to be careful with how I word this
Ooh,
because I
I'm
don't want to
excited.
sound like I'm inviting Trump to break any laws or do anything that will destroy important democratic and constitutional norms that we'll later
Interesting.
miss. I am not saying that. However, he clearly has shown that he's willing to push the boundaries of executive power. And he's probably going to push those in some unhealthy directions. There's also, I think, on some of the DEI stuff, ways in which he could push the boundaries of executive power that might be healthy or at least worth considering, right? Worth a try. I think there's a lot of legal mechanisms that I won't go into, but people just don't know about, and kind of esoteric legal arguments that could potentially be used to really put the screws in on DEI and some other stuff, and certainly could be used to really put pressure on universities. I think people should be asking. He's like done the obvious stuff. Kind of, what is some of the less obvious stuff that he could do? Um, Including stuff that might rely on not like crazy or illogical arguments, but sort of untested uh, arguments. I'm not talking about,
What?
so for example, I don't know all the laws on this, but um, think about accreditation agencies.
Ooh.
Um, you know, it's not totally clear what the federal government can do to rein in accreditation agencies, but in theory, right, these things are recognized by the Department of Education. That's what kind of gives them their power. That's what basically makes them gatekeepers of federal funding de facto, right? Because the rule is that if the education department recognizes you as an accreditor, then, schools have to have your accreditation in order to be eligible for federal funding. My understanding is that they can't just sort of revoke the accreditor's status overnight, but there probably are things that they could do to really go after the accrediting agencies that have never been done before, right? Like no one has really, it's never occurred to the government, I think, to like sue an accrediting agency for discrimination. But you probably could. There probably exist legal theories that would let you sue accrediting agencies. There are other theories that might let you invalidate a lot of kind of disparate impact law almost overnight, depending on how you interpret a certain order or depending on whether you allowed for certain consent degrees to take hold. This is very kind of technocratic in the weeds stuff, but basically my understanding is that there's a lot of things that have probably been batted around behind the scenes, at least to some extent, that could have really big effects, but which it just no one's really talking about because they're more complicated. But I think that, I don't necessarily have the highest hopes for this, but like there clearly are actually very smart legal people working for Trump. And for better or worse, we live in a world where both parties have tried to use lawfare to accomplish their political ends and have been very willing to use creative and novel interpretations of statutes to get their way. And I don't know if, again, I'm not necessarily saying that Trump should do this because I think that kind of creative lawyering can be really bad and undermine a lot of important norms. But it wouldn't surprise me if it happens, right?
Yeah, well,
and I think people should be paying more attention to some of the ways in which it could happen. That's
well, if
what I'll say.
does, we'll bring you back on the show to blame you and read you the riot act for, enabling the rise of a dictator or something. I mean, I think that's all really interesting. The rule of law in general is really one of my biggest lingering concerns with a lot of this, including Doge, which I'm supportive of in its objectives, if not all of its methods necessarily. But I really appreciate you joining us,
Thank you so
Aaron. It
much,
was
Aaron.
a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. We drop a new episode every Thursday, so if you want to support the work we do, please like and share this episode, subscribe to our new YouTube channel, and follow the show on your favorite podcasting app. See you next time.